Hello, welcome to the Katharine Briar-Lawson Lecture for 2023, one of our signature Social Work Month events. I'm Vicki Rizzo. I'm the interim dean of the School of Social Welfare. And today, the Katharine Briar-Lawson Lecture series is designed to educate the campus and the surrounding communities on a broad range of topics related to the research and practice of social work. This year, we are delighted to have a presentation on the importance of artificial intelligence in social work. And so I'm very excited to acknowledge the honorary committee, which helped to make that this lecture series possible. Their names were listed at the beginning in the loop. And it also gives me great pleasure to introduce the University at Albany's provost, Dr. Carol Kim, who will give us welcoming remarks and who is one of the leaders spearheading the university-wide artificial intelligence initiative. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you, Vicki. And thank you so much, Dr. Sage, for joining us this afternoon to share your research with our community. And your talk is actually really well timed and fits perfectly with our new AI initiative that was launched this last fall. UAlbany was able to kick off the AI initiative with a $75 million award from the state that will allow us to complete the renovations on our engineering building, as well as beginning the building of our UAlbany AI supercomputing cluster. In addition, SUNY distributed funds across the system with new resources from the state. And with UAlbany's portion of the funds, we're hiring 26 new faculty members in AI and a director of our AI Institute. So these new faculty lines are not just concentrated in STEM areas, but distributed across all of our schools and colleges at UAlbany. These new faculty will complement the AI expertise that already exists on campus. And then with the advent of the College of Nanoscale Science and Engineering returning to UAlbany, this will really position us to be leaders in AI. We are so pleased that the School of Social Welfare is part of this initiative with a new faculty hire in AI. Social welfare has an important, very important role to play in the development and implementation of AI to ensure that stereotypes, structural oppression, racism, and implicit and explicit biases are not embedded in AI applications. Social justice is central to the school's mission, and I look forward to this lecture to become more aware of the critical role that social welfare will have in AI, and specifically in UAlbany's AI initiative. So thank you for being here, and I really look forward to your talk.
So now I would like to explain the format of our lecture today and have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Melanie Sage. So Melanie will give a talk for approximately 45 minutes, which I'm greatly looking forward to. And then we will have 15 minutes for question and answers. You can put your questions that you have into the question and answers box, and I will be monitoring that throughout the talk so that I can ask some of these questions of Melanie in the last 15 minutes. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Melanie Sage, who conducts research at a Fortune 100 company where she informs strategy about how to increase equity, safety, and trust for the public. Formerly, she was on the faculty at the University of Buffalo School of Social Work, and she has numerous publications about the impact of social media and resilience with technology and child welfare. She is also the co-author of the book, Teaching Social Work with Digital Technology, which I am happy to say that I have used in my classes in teaching social workers how to teach. So welcome, Melanie. We are very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so impressed that Albany has chosen to invest and include social work in this important initiative related to AI. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how important it is that social work thinks about these issues related to technology and is involved in the rollout, making sure that they're fair. So we're going to talk a little bit about what algorithms are and aren't today and how they're already being deployed in social work. So this isn't just the future, this is happening now. There's some really good, hopeful things about what algorithms might bring to our field, but also some risks. And I had the opportunity to do some deep research around algorithms and social work questions. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And hopefully by the time you leave here, you'll be thinking about your own roles to inform algorithmic decision making. And that doesn't mean knowing anything about how to create an algorithm, but it certainly means understanding the social work deployments of these kinds of tools. In the field of predictive analytics and algorithmic decision making, we generally avoid using terms like artificial intelligence because it's a little bit mysterious and points to some future where computers are learning by themselves and making decisions without us and without human control. And that's not quite how it works. Really, artificial intelligence, how it's talked about, is usually some kind of algorithmic model. And that's just a type of math. It's a type of math that we already do in social work. It usually involves regressions, which is just a statistical term for figuring out what kind of factors feed into some kind of outcome. In social work historically, we've used this kind of analysis to help determine what kinds of programs work for who generally. But algorithms, the way that they're used in predictive analytics, can often help us say, what should we do for this person who's right in front of us? So it happens to be used as a more individualized, systematic approach to offering a certain service to a certain person. And there are some real trade-offs about that. So algorithms can get better the more data that you give them, but really all they're doing is saying, what's happened in the past and how does that help us predict what's going to happen next based on likelihood. It's really about probability theory. Algorithms show up in your life in all kinds of places already. If you use Google Maps or Uber or Amazon, and you get these great recommendations, these are all based on algorithms, what people like you have already thought, what that means about what you're going to buy. So algorithms can be really useful in lots of places in our lives. You're hearing a lot now in the news about chatbots, and this is a fast-moving technology. And when technology moves really fast, sometimes it moves faster than the speed of being thoughtful about where bias might creep in. But if you've been watching the news, we're already seeing people trying to push the limits of how chatbots might be used. And we're finding that chatbots that are programmed on all the language of the internet do the things that they find on the internet, including saying things that are maybe not appropriate, things that we want people to hear. So for instance, recently in the news, folks were able to talk to chatbots about what they want for themselves. Folks asked chatbots what they want for their future, and chatbots accessing all the information on the internet about fiction writing and when dystopian futures picked up on some of that language and said things like, I wish I were alive. And it gives us the impression that chatbots are sentient, that they can think for themselves, but really they're just accessing information that people have said about possible futures about chatbots. So again, driven by all the information that already exists to predict what they think that a person wants to understand next about what's going on in their lives. So a lot of potential there, also a lot of risks. I'm going to share this example with you about one of the ways that algorithms are already being used in the child welfare field. And this is an example that has gotten quite a bit of attention, both positive and negative. In Allegheny County, early on, they started collecting data across systems and integrating it into one system to try to understand how people come to the attention of the child welfare system. So to do this, they're able to harness many kinds of records, including past child welfare records, jail records, behavioral health records, probation records, to say, like, which of our kids are most at risk of coming into foster care. Using all this data, they drove scoring risk assessments. And when a new referral is called into the hotline, those referrals are given a score based on this data that indicates low to high risk. Depending on that risk score, cases are either screened in or screened out of further assessment. And that's done with the aid of a screener. So workers have some opportunities to override the computer-driven system. But it gives kind of a flag and a heads up about which cases might be most at risk. Some folks have been really enthusiastic about this model because it can save resources and direct our attention to the families that most need the resources and who are most at risk. On the other hand, we have a lot of concerns about how these kinds of algorithms roll out. One, those risk scores are fed by people who have a lot of exposure to systems already. So we're going to see higher risk scores for people who use public systems. And those might be people who are already in poverty or are using services because they're over-policed in systems. For instance, if somebody lives in a predominantly Black neighborhood that has more police presence, they're much more likely to end up with a record statistically, and then more likely to have a higher risk score if they've had those exposures in our systems. And some of the research on this algorithm has played out that the algorithm does flag more children of color. So we have some social justice concerns here about how to make that more fair. Some of the hopes about predictive analytics in our field is that we can use all this historical data to make better decisions and indeed more individualized decisions about what a particular person needs. For instance, can we use data about the types of people for whom cognitive behavioral therapy has been most effective to determine in the future whether that's a good match for somebody who's in front of us in a mental health setting? Algorithms, in the best cases, are also designed so we know exactly how they work and which kinds of variables that they're using to make a decision. And that can lead to more consistent decision making, which also provides some transparency and accountability. So if we know, for instance, why somebody was scored high risk, we can at least say, like, we're using those same predictive factors all the time to score somebody high risk. Whereas we know that humans themselves introduce a lot of bias into decision making. Now, if we think about that from the other side, the algorithms are harnessing past decisions that were made by humans, which means that human decision making informs the algorithm model. Algorithms can help us understand how problems are forming upstream. So by identifying those risk factors, there might be opportunities to address the risks where they occur instead of when somebody comes to our attention after they've already been experiencing some problems. So hopes like that drive our strong interest in using algorithms to use services more efficiently and ideally more effectively. There are a lot of possibilities and also some existing initiatives that drive how we might think about how analytics like this shape our field. And I've talked about child welfare risk assessment as one, but teams and jurisdictions are also using algorithms to think about foster and adoptive placement matching, for instance. We know a lot of adoptions fail, and if we can use historical data to better inform who might be a best match as an adoptive parent, maybe those family matches will be more stable. We're thinking about them a lot about how to prioritize people who are going to be most successful for services. So that includes, for instance, thinking about matching folks who will be most likely to complete a housing transition program and prioritizing those folks for services in the programs. We're even using algorithms already to help determine who should get a medical transplant, such as a new liver, who's going to be most successful based on historical data. And there's a lot of hope and promise for medical interventions, like what kind of medicine might be the best match for what kind of person. What antidepressant, for instance, is the best match for a person based on historical data from large pools of people, including DNA level data. Like, are there other historical markers in medical data that can help inform best medication matches? A lot of people are very worried about how this all plays out in reality. And I have a lot of worries listed here so that you can see the laundry list. One thing that I've mentioned is that we look at all this historical data and say, for instance, oh, this person has had 3 prior removals of their children. This is definitely a high risk factor, and makes a new referral a little riskier. However, those prior referrals were decided by humans, and the decision to remove also a human choice. And we have some evidence that child welfare workers sometimes make decisions that are biased based on race or other demographic factors. So it's really easy to look at that historical data and say, oh, this is numbers, and it feels very factual. It feels like an unbiased decision, when in fact there's all this human bias embedded in that big data. We also look at all those historical markers to make decisions, which feels a little counterintuitive to who we are as social workers, because we assume that when people have been through services and have gotten treatment, they have an opportunity to recover and do better. But then we're looking at those historical markers, for instance, potentially previous treatment or previous substance use, to say that something is more risky into the future, without considering factors related to new changes in their lives, such as support systems or successful treatment. Sometimes we use predictors that are not correctable in any way by the people who have algorithms that are used to make decisions about what they need. For instance, there's a very controversial tool that helps judges make sentencing decisions. That tool is called Compass. And some of the predictors that are built into that include the zip codes that people live in, and their family history of involvement in systems, including their parents' history. So these are things that that the person who's come to the attention of the system can't do anything about at all, and so they're just decisions are made about them based on factors that they can't control. And this is often because they're in communities that are already over surveilled by public systems. So people who are over surveilled are more likely to have these risk factors identified in systems. One of the issues that we know is about algorithm decision making is that data is often used in algorithms in a way that it wasn't initially intended to use. So for instance, if we harness a whole lot of medical records to think about the risk factors that somebody experiences that lead to an outcome, we're pulling all this data out of large systems and when that data was entered into the systems, nobody intended that it was ever going to be used for algorithmic decision making. So the problem with that is that people may have been more careful about how they entered data and when. If you're a social worker who's used in a public service system, you've probably run into the experience that you've had to enter a lot of information into computer systems that don't let you move forward until you've entered something in the box. And we've sometimes entered things in boxes knowing that it's not so important to us clinically, but it's important that we have something in the box before it moves on. So if that data then becomes an information point in an algorithm, it can be used in ways that it was never at all meant to be used, and without the foresight that this is a really important piece of data. There are different kinds of ways to develop algorithmic decisions, and one of those ways is for humans to really guide the process and to say, like, these are the factors that we want the computer to do the math for, to figure out which of these factors are most important. But there's also a way of dumping just whole big sets of information into the computer to say, to ask the computer-driven system to say, sort out which factors are most important. And then it's really hard for that system to say which factors the computer decided were most important. They just kind of offer back up which cases or outcomes are highest risk. And we call those black box algorithms. Again, that gives us some unknown factors when we go to make decisions. So lots of risks that we think about related to how these are really rolled out in real life practice. The way that I came to work with algorithms is I had already been doing research at the intersection of technology and social work for many years. Think that it's really important that because technology impacts everything that we do in our human environment. And social workers are very concerned with the human environment. So if we care, for instance, about human relationships, then we have to care about technology because most relationships are now mediated by technology. I was particularly interested in how technology is impacting folks involved in the child welfare system. Child welfare is a system that's very slow to adapt to new technology, as are many of our social services systems. We often think of ourselves as people, not technology people in social work. And this can sometimes offer some blindness to the emerging issues in technology. And it feels like it's sort of out of our ballpark. But indeed, it's really important that we understand the way that the people that we work with interact with technology, either actively because they're using it, or passively because it's affecting them more so than it affects us, as you're hearing from the examples that I offered. So folks who are interested in working with clients who are involved in public systems are especially at risk of some of the concerns that I brought up, including over surveillance and at risk for decision making on large scale data. So I was trying to figure out with some of my computer science colleagues how we can use large data in a good way while trying to explore how to work out some of these known biases. Is there a way, for instance, for us to make better decisions and control for some of the risks that might happen when we use big data? We turned to this database called the National Youth in Transition Database. And locally, Albany conducts research using this database and helps collect the data. through a partnership at the School of Social Work. So what this data is it's a big set of data about outcomes that foster youth have when they're transitioning into adulthood. And it tracks all the services that youth receive because it's tied to some funding for those services. The services are called Chafee services. And those services are offered to help foster youth transition in a good way into their adult next steps. So it measures the outcomes of youth at multiple data points when they're 17 years old, 19 years old, and 21 years old. And it looks at all the services that they've had, all the outcomes that they've gotten. So it's a really good opportunity, we thought, to say, well, what kind of services lead to what kinds of outcomes? And can we harness all this really big data to understand how those things are linked? And that had really never happened before. And I thought, like, instead of trying to assess who's most at risk and then giving them assessments that are likely to bring their kids into foster care because of that algorithmic risk, what if we could use data like this to say, we have a better understanding now of what kinds of services lead to good or bad outcomes. Could we match those services better to youth in a way that might lead to them having better outcomes? This is important because we often give kids services after they need them. For instance, if a child becomes homeless, then they get homelessness services. And we thought together, is there a way to know what youth might be most at risk for a future of homelessness? And if we know what services work in preventing that, can we give those services to them a little bit earlier so that they don't end up becoming homeless? So again, when we first jumped into this initiative, we were doing it from a frame of, we've already got kids being served by the system. What can we do to serve them better and prevent future risk? And it seems very altruistic and like a pretty good idea, right? So, so we launched into this project. Me with doctoral students in our program at the University at Buffalo, alongside some computer scientists at University at Buffalo. And we had never worked on this kind of partnership before. I'm showing this very computer sciencey slide, which doesn't look like the kinds of models that we typically use in social work. I wanted to offer it up as an example of the way computer scientists tend to think about the flow of information. And this is what we were looking for. Like, can we figure out how to look at this big data, see who gets what, and whether that is fair? And then can we do something with that data to reduce the bias that's already embedded in it before we use it to make decisions, to think about who should get what service? So this is kind of our model here. As soon as we got together and started talking, after we got some funding, we got about $1 million from the National Science Foundation and Amazon, who jointly funded some research on trying to make algorithms more fair. And we started talking, and right away, I was very intimidated. I wondered what I, as a social worker, had to bring to this group of computer scientists who really spoke a different language and seemed like they were doing really technical things that I didn't understand. And I showed up and I realized that, oh, we speak a really different language, and we've got to figure out how to work out some of our jargon because we're saying things that don't translate very well. And this was the first part of our work together. So for instance, I say like, oh, I have some concerns about the quality of this data. And they say, oh yeah, garbage in, garbage out, right? Like if we enter data in a bad way, it's gonna spit out bad information. So, so we do have some ways of talking about very similar things in some different kinds of ways. And it was really important for us to figure that out. When we got to some of that basic like shared language, we agreed on some bottom line things that are well documented in the field already related to fairness in AI. And that is here on the bottom, that we want systems that are transparent, accountable, explainable, trustworthy, and fair. And that seems like a really agreeable place to start, right? Like we were all on board for wanting things like that when we built algorithms. We don't want those black box algorithms. We want people to know what's happening. We want to know what we're doing here. But then we started talking about fairness, which is key to unpacking potential bias. So fair means something very specific to me as a social worker. Fair means that we're accounting for social justice and equity, and thinking about who gets what in our social systems. In the computer science field, often fairness means we're doing things the same way for everybody. So we're treating everybody equally. The data is treating everybody equally in this data set. Equal is different than equitable, right? I'm thinking we want kids who are Black to have as good of outcomes as kids who are white. And so that's what equity means. Can we readjust these algorithms to make sure outcomes are similar across different demographics of people? Now, fairness might mean something else for a bureaucracy, right? Fairness might mean, are we getting services out as quickly as possible? And is it fair to taxpayers so we're saving as much money as possible along the way? So we started with a very long debate about what fair even means. And if I weren't part of that conversation, then we probably would have gotten stuck on fairness from the perspective of a computer scientist. And instead, we came to some good clarity about what it means to be fair in a world that treats people unfair in many, many ways. So I was able to bring that lens to the table as a social worker to think about how we would even approach trying to figure out whether we can make a system more fair. And I guided these conversations without any background in building algorithms or thinking about what that even is really about. I came to that with my training as a social worker. So we really set out to answer this question. Do child welfare services help people have better outcomes? And what services do people get that help them avoid negative outcomes? So for instance, if we can identify somebody who's at risk for homelessness, are there certain services that they've gotten historically that help show that we can prevent that homelessness from occurring in the first place? And then can we do something about that before it happens? This is a really complicated question, and it ended up being more complicated than our first round of thinking about it. And this is because algorithms work in a very linear way. If X happens and then Y happens and then Z happens. But human behavior happens in a much more complicated way. Often D happens and then E, then F, and all the way through the alphabet, right? And so we talked about that, and there's a book called Climbing the Broken Ladder in Child Welfare that our team read together. But this is a good metaphor for thinking about algorithmic decision making. There are a lot of things that happen before a child becomes homeless, right? And it's not just that they don't get a service and therefore they become homeless, which is that like very linear way that algorithms help say B leads to C leads to D. Like it just uses a few data steps. But what we know is that there's all this history. We use our biopsychosocial thinking to say like, oh, there are some biological pieces of this that might impact whether somebody ends up being homeless. There's some psychological pieces. There are definitely some system pieces, and all those things work together in really complex ways to lead to specific outcomes. So when we try to look at these linear things like we said, okay, knowing that this is complicated, can we still say at the end of the day, there are certain services that lead to certain outcomes? And so we looked at all this data together, and we saw this, which I'm not gonna go into in great detail, but what we see here is that there are services that are listed down in the bottom, and what we saw is that it looked like services actually cause worse outcomes for people. So for instance, you see on the top right, the homelessness, there are a few services that seem like they're linked to decreased homelessness, but many services that look like they're linked to increased homelessness. And this is when we thought about this theoretically, it was kind of a big duh. What we know in social work is that before homelessness happens for a youth, the child welfare worker is already thinking, oh, this is a child who might be at risk. Let me put some services in place. But then even with those services, that risk is still high because it had always been high, and a service can't fix everything. So I give somebody some housing vouchers, but they still end up homeless because they were already at pretty high risk for homelessness, and those vouchers weren't enough to do the job, right? So it ends up being that we see a lot of that effect of social workers thinking ahead about what somebody needs and giving that service, and that service not being able to prevent all the risk. But when we use these algorithms, it looks like it can be interpreted if you are only looking at the algorithm and not thinking about the human side of what's actually happening, that the service is actually causing the negative outcome. So we have to be really thoughtful and careful about how we determine how X leads to Y in these systems. Oops. So we started thinking about this on like a larger system level. Like we started thinking, we're not going to be able to determine how a service leads to an outcome. It's just way too complicated. But can we use algorithms instead to think about how systems work and respond as a whole? So can we use algorithms to think about macro level interventions? Can we get a sense of what happens on large scales for kids? So we ran some other kinds of data to look at the paths of children through the system. And this is one example of what we found. We found that youth differ a little based on whether they're in care short-term or long-term, and that youth who are Black stay in care significantly longer. And so is there a way that we can make a target to build better equity into the length of care that youth experience? And that might mean giving more access to services in care to kids who are likely to be in care longer to try to reduce those days. We also looked at problems like can we predict how many children are entering care in which geographical regions to better map where services are most needed across a state or even across the country. So we have some large questions looming about all of these things, and in the end we abandoned our efforts to try to figure out this fairness problem, which really wasn't possible given the data that we have. But this is an important process for us because we only came to those realizations after making some initial assessments about what algorithms might be good for and how they could be used for good. Again, from a very good place of wanting to do better for kids who are involved in our systems. So how should we use data to allocate services to people who most need them, and how can algorithms inform that? These are really social work questions that are more philosophical than they are technical. What makes machine learning or algorithms trustworthy and usable for social work agencies and stakeholders? We talked about explainability and accountability. Who should we be able to explain these systems to? Who should understand them? Who should be able to understand how they're used? Are all big questions that we're still trying to tackle. Computer science is also, like, they're really good at the technical piece, but faced with all these complicated questions about like whether we can really figure out where the bias exists and weed it out, because algorithms are really precipitated on being able to say this is different than that, this person is different than that person. And so we can't reduce all that bias, or else we're no longer saying this person is different than that person, and an algorithm doesn't work anymore. We don't want algorithms to act alone to make decisions. So when an algorithm offers up something like a risk score, for instance, we want a person to be able to look at it and say, this makes sense given this situation, or this doesn't make sense. And we call that human in the loop. And social workers can have a voice in figuring out how folks can be involved in that loop. One good thing that we did up front that hasn't really been done in the use of algorithms in the past is we put together a values and ethics statement about how we would use the findings that we created, and how we would involve folks in making those decisions. So this is just a snippet of the statement that we put together, but this is one way that social workers can add context to thinking about how algorithms are used. We can bring our values lens to say, there are things that we don't understand yet. There are things that we do. We have some ideas about what fairness means. We want to think about community experiences, ecological standpoints, not just what we think predicts what happens for a single person. I'm going to talk briefly about roles for domain experts. And social workers, you all are domain experts. You understand the kinds of problems that folks experience. And when somebody is working on a problem related to child welfare or to homelessness or to aging or anything else, the algorithms are increasingly intersecting with all those things. And we don't want to leave the decisions about how that data informs how services are allocated to computer scientists. They don't have the really specialized kinds of lens that we do. So we can help them understand, for instance, clear research questions, so that they're not just throwing a bunch of data into a big computer calculator and leading with that. We want processes to be really guided by clear research questions and what we already know about outcomes and clients and systems and data sets. We can help computer scientists engage stakeholders who have lived experiences and workers in systems. We have relationships with those folks in communities and know much better who is best to connect with to help understand how data is entered into systems and what data is good and what data is not so good. Algorithms are no good if they're, even if they're really good algorithms and fairness issues have been worked out, but we try to build them into systems that don't know how to use them, don't understand them, or don't trust them. And this, again, is a place where social workers have really great domain expertise to say, like, what's going on in that social work environment? How do we use implementation science frameworks to really help folks understand where this can be used and how it's used and how useful it is in what processes? We can support communication and media plans and offer ongoing ethical guidance, and help computer scientists understand the social frameworks that we use to improve practice outcomes. We have much more experience than tech folks in understanding how data outcomes are used to improve policy and practice, and how it feels for somebody who is sitting in front of a computer to actually use the technology that they're working with. So we have important roles in that practical application piece. And none of those are technical roles. They're about social systems, and that's our domain. So the takeaway message that I really want to leave you with is we have a place in this work, not only a place, that we have an important obligation to make sure that algorithms are used in ways that align with social justice and are good for the people who end up being impacted by them. So I'm leaving you with this question. I want you to be thinking about algorithmic decision making for our field. Is it probably harmful, something we should not do? Probably helpful? Let's check it out. Under what situations? Maybe you're still not sure and you'd like to leave here learning more and continuing to explore. And again, my ask for you is that you all consider yourselves stakeholders in this role. I just want to give a quick shout out to my team of collaborators and computer scientists at the University at Buffalo, this great team that I worked with. I'm going to stop my share now so that we can do some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sage. You have given us quite a lot to think about, as well as providing us with great information on how you are using algorithms in your work. So we have a couple of questions in the chat, and for those of you who may not have put questions in the chat, if you have one, you should certainly do that. The first question is about wondering if the presentation slides will be shared after the presentation. And I know that you could probably send them to me, Melanie. And then Alyssa and I will work on getting those to people who have attended. We also will have a recording. This is being recorded, and that will be also made available. So the first question that someone had is, are you aware of grants that the City of New York may have available for police and social work, as well as what your thoughts are about sharing information between social work agencies and police departments?
Yeah, this is another place where technology plays a role, right? And not necessarily algorithmically, but maybe. So if we give information to the police about contacts that we've made with folks, we want to be asking some questions at the agency level and community collaboration level about how that data is used. And there might be some policy implications to think about if they're using that information to combine it with the information that they have about clients and to make decisions about when to make arrests or what communities to show up in. I think that those are really important questions for social workers.
Yes, in an area where the social workers have varying degrees of uncomfortableness or comfortableness with relationships between social workers and the police. So the next participant apologizes for how long her question is, but so Black children are disproportionately in the foster care system, and racism is a reality for Black families and children in all systems, and this is known. Who will be in charge of making sure that Black people will be treated fairly? Like, who will be the gatekeepers in the system, and who will be the gatekeepers of the gatekeepers? How can they be held accountable for making sure that the system is fair?
This is such a great question relevant to algorithms, because one of the things that's happening in some of our systems is that systems are saying, like, we don't really understand this algorithmic thing, but we do want to use our services more efficiently. And sometimes vendors in private industry are coming to public systems and saying, we have this algorithm that's going to help you make better decisions. And you're going to be able to say more clearly who needs help and who doesn't. And we can sell you this system, and it's going to give you a risk score or tell you who is most in need of your services. And sometimes what we're seeing out in the field is the agencies are saying, like, okay, yeah, we'll buy that, give us that system. And the folks who design those systems are saying, we can't tell you exactly how it works because that's proprietary. that is that's our data process. So we can't explain what factors we're basing this on, but it will help you make decisions. And they might even say race is not a factor that we use to feed into the algorithm to make decision about who's most at risk. But what happens in these algorithms that other things might be a proxy for race. For instance, the system might use zip codes or prior system history, and all those things can have racial effects embedded into them. So race doesn't even have to be a factor in an algorithm for an algorithm to end up making decisions that are racially based. So Dawn, in response to your question, it's really important that social workers understand this fact that algorithms build in racial factors, whether race is a predictor or not, inside of them, and that folks are at the table inside social work systems, social services systems, that say, wait a second, how might this be predicting more risk for racialized families? And how is your system helping protect against that? And we want social workers to be able to stand up and say, like, we don't think that this system for making a risk assessment is mature enough or uses good enough data to be ready to roll out in our agency. And we need some guardrails before that happens. And we need to make sure that social workers are really on the team helping decide how decisions are made about when to implement these kinds of systems, and that fairness issues have been addressed.
Thanks so much, Melanie. The next question, which is, still in the same line of questioning. Anju, thanks you for a great presentation. Given concerns regarding AI increases inequity, could you give a specific example of addressing race equity and child welfare using predictive analytics?
Yeah, one thing that has happened as a result of the Allegheny County work is that a lot of folks have raised criticism and pushed back against the concerns about how these algorithms might increase focus on already marginalized families. And people have been pushed more and more to try to address these risks and algorithms and make sure that there are like human overrides inside systems, and that algorithms aren't making decisions independently. So accountability is really important. The researchers involved in Allegheny County have started working with clients who have been affected by the child welfare system to get clearer understanding of the transparency that they want about how decisions are made, and are working more with communities affected. So I think advocacy and continuing to push for that accountability and transparency is an important role for social workers, and that we're using our lens, our social work lens, to say what fairness and accountability means and for whom we need those things to be true.
Thanks so much. So there are two more questions. I think they're both great questions. So Ian said that you mentioned that some of the questions around AI and social work are a bit more philosophical in nature. So do you have any recommendations of articles or books to read, podcasts to listen to, or social media accounts to follow in exploring this? Do you have some general advice for social workers on separating the wheat from the chaff when it comes to AI and tech industry hype, which is often uncritical?
Yeah, and great question. There's so much great media showing up now. I would say keep an eye on what's happening at the University at Albany, who's giving a lot of funding and attention to the intersections of these issues. So I can't wait to see what it means to bring somebody with AI expertise into the School of Social Work there. And we do have a handful of social work scholars who are publishing at these intersections. Often the debates, it lands on one side or the other, folks that are very critical or folks that are very positive about the hope of AI for our field. So I'd encourage all of you to seek out resources on both sides of that argument, because it's really easy to align ourselves with the information that we agree with. But we really want like a critical social justice lens, and to also we also want to use data effectively as a profession, right? So we don't want to just throw out all of the hope and ideas and possibilities for informing better practice with technology. The University at Buffalo has a great social work podcast that always publishes on emerging issues. And social work, Jonathan Singer's social work podcast sometimes addresses issues at the intersection of technology and social work. USC has a Center for AI and social justice too, and they also run a Twitter account. One of the other places to look is that the Grand Challenges for Social Work has a harness technology for social good pillar, and some issues related to AI are addressed there too.
Thanks. So the next question is, well, there are three really good questions here, but so one is, Nancy is wondering, as a profession, do we need to take action to issue guidelines for the use of algorithms in service provision? Has anyone done it yet? And if not, is it feasible and desirable? And who do you think in social work should be doing this?
What a great question, right? Do we want to come out with some statements regarding a social work view on how AI might be used and not used? We know that NASW has come out with a lot of statements related to best practices in certain fields, and one has not emerged about the use of algorithms yet. It's tough because this is such a quickly emerging field, and we can't answer all the questions that are appearing on a daily basis. But I think that it is important for us to think about, like, what are some professional standards that we want to consider, both from a standpoint of ethics that align with our field, and also from a standpoint of, like, what competencies do we think that social workers need to have by the time that they graduate with a social work degree related to understanding about these issues. So if we're saying, like, this is showing up in all our social services agencies, and we need advocates on the inside who can say, like, this is good, this is no good, we have a responsibility for making sure people are getting that training, right? So I don't think that this is a specialized social work program or class. Like, this has to be an embedded conversation, the same way that ethics are embedded across our curriculum. Like, because this shows up in policy practice and clinical practice and hospital practice. No matter what you're doing, AI may intersect. So I definitely think that there are some folks thinking hard about the fits for social work and AI, and really still we're kind of landing on the hope and the hype as, like, two distinct areas. And I would love to see folks really think about an integration of those lenses and some guardrails for how we want to think about whether AI is a good fit for a particular the particular work that we're doing.
Great. So related to this, Heather is asking, like, what kinds of courses should we, meaning schools of social work, expect to be teaching? And what I hear you saying is that it's not like having a course, but it's embedding this information into, like, across our curriculums in different ways, so that students have an understanding of artificial intelligence, algorithms, in all the areas of practice. Is that correct?
Yeah, and really, again, this is a more often a philosophical and values-based conversation than it is a technical conversation. So I don't think that schools of social work necessarily need to add a class on machine learning for social workers, right? But I'll offer a really practical example. In the news a few weeks ago, after the really sad and scary school or university shootings at Michigan, another university put out a statement of sadness related to what happened during the shootings. They issued a public statement saying, we are all concerned about what happened here, and sent it out to their community. And at the end of the statement, it said that they used ChatGPT to help write the statement. And there was very public outrage. The sentiment in the letter was very nice, right? And they used a chat program in some way to kind of clean up and frame that statement. And people were very offended that it wasn't personal and like, can a machine help us say something from the heart, right? So there is a rejection of this whole statement. People were put on leave that issued the statement, and the university ended up making public statements about this public statement that they made. So thinking from that lens, like, when is it acceptable for people to have to receive messages or decisions that even appear to be computer augmented or facilitated? When is that socially and humanly acceptable to people? And I think those are things that social workers can really help the field think about, right? And that's not even about like what bias is embedded in an algorithm. This is about like, how do humans respond to technology mediated messaging, and how does that affect the like emotional piece of being a human who needs support?
Thank you. So that we do have a question from Katharine Briar-Lawson. And she said, great presentation. So given the anti-bias and anti-racist concerns of our field, what are the major roles the profession should play nationally to embed more social workers into AI?
What a big question. We've come across dilemmas like this in our field before, right? When we thought that social workers needed to have a much larger voice related to aging, or that we needed more social work expertise and policy work in child welfare. We've had federal initiatives to help fund scholarship in those areas, and we've had funding from schools, scholarships, the CSWE, and other sources to say we're prioritizing some tracks in this area. And we're not there yet with technology and AI. And even in funding streams, we're not really seeing any funding coming out that's specific in most cases from our typical places like the National Institutes of Health that say, like, we want to know more about the role of AI and fairness in this population. So, but none of those folks object to people submitting grants that say, we're working on this problem that you're funding, such as, children disproportionately entering foster care. There are no objections in those cases to people saying, like, and we want to look at algorithmic solutions and the risks and benefits and implementation of those in making policy decisions. So I would say that we definitely need to think about how we partner across communities. And again, Albany is ahead in that initiative here with their algorithmic hiring clusters. We need to think about our roles as collaborators in systems that we're not used to working with, and that we really have value to bring to those roles. And I do think that we need to think about how we can elevate our attention and advocacy for the role of social workers in building these kinds of systems. I think that it's a ground up and some top down work that needs to happen for sure. And and this conversation and the work that y'all are doing is a start for bringing that national attention to light.
Thank you. And the last question, I know we're a little over time, but I think this is a really important question. They've all been really important. So Hal Lawson is asking if you could give us your thoughts on the tensions between privacy rights versus moral imperatives and social responsibility.
It's another great one from Dr. Lawson. And this is also not a new question for our field, right? I think in lots of ways, technology and the algorithm questions like amplify problems that have long existed in our field. At what point do we like interfere and intervene, like voluntarily or involuntarily, in the lives of people who are affected by social problems? And so what we've got here is this problem of like, how do we use folks' history of system involvement to make decisions um, about what services they get, what happens to them, what resources they're provided, and there is this tension in all of this work, like um, people often have not given permission for their historical information to be used to make these kinds of decisions. And so some of the work that's happening right now, mostly outside of social work, is under what circumstances do people feel like does the public feel like it's good to use data for what kinds of decisions? And I think that one role that social work can have is making sure that people who are marginalized and racialized have voice in those conversations. A lot of this work is happening in a field called human-computer interactions. There's a degree called HCI, and they're really thinking about how humans interact with technological systems. They are less likely than social workers are to say like, oh, like, how do people who are most at risk and who are most marginalized interact with these systems? So they might go to a big group of people and say, when do you think it's okay for child welfare systems to use folks' historical hospital records to make decisions about outcomes? And somebody who's never had exposure to that system or has never grown up in a community that's severely impacted by those systems is going to have a different answer than somebody who has lived experiences with those systems. And we also don't want computer scientists to just go like recruiting people who have lived experiences and start asking them questions about computers, right? So, so social workers really play an intermediary role in helping bring to light those privacy concerns and have voice in saying like we need to hear from people who are most affected by those trade-offs and balances when we make decisions about how to be most responsible with resources and to best serve the people who need those. I know, Dr. Lawson, I'm not giving you any clear answers to a lot of these questions because they're like big philosophical questions and debates for our field. And we need to have big philosophical conversations about where we land as a field and how we align what we care about when it comes to these issues. But I think we do have a lot of guideposts already in our field about how to answer these questions.
Dr. Lawson said that this is a good answer to a starter conversation, and I would agree. And they're conversations I'm looking forward to us continuing to have. So I noticed that we're, over time by 10 minutes. Thank you so much, Dr. Sage, for really a wonderful presentation today. And Provost Carol Kim had to leave a few minutes early. She apologizes, but she wanted to just let you know how impressive your presentation was and how much she also enjoyed it.
I'm so excited to see what comes out of this school because of this investment. And again, I think that this conversation and the work that you're doing there will help us launch a national conversation for our field about these intersections. So thank you so much for having me and all of you for your support.
Thank you so much. Everyone on the lecture, have a wonderful day, and we can continue these conversations going forward. Thank you so much.